Today, we will study and reflect on Frederick Douglass's first slave autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born an illiterate slave who escaped slavery in the decades before the Civil War. With great efforts, he became truly literate, and after he escaped slavery, he joined the abolitionist movement, quickly becoming a leader of the movement and a spellbinding orator and a best-selling author with this slave autobiography that we're going to study. Now you may ask, what can we learn by pondering the slave autobiography by Frederick Douglass? We should never forget how brutal slavery was before the Civil War, how this brutality and callousness toward the black race survived the defeat of the Southern cause of slavery, and how the brutality and callousness of white supremacy poisons our politics today. We can learn how we can become more compassionate towards the legitimate fears of our black brothers by studying our history, and we can share the story with our acquaintances so we can defeat both ignorance and prejudice. Plus, it's a fascinating history of what it was like to live in a very different time and place when there were so very few of the modern conveniences that we take for granted. We always like to select quotes from the author himself in our videos. At the end of our talk, we will discuss our source for this video and my blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn and reflect together. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies. His first autobiography, which we're going to review today, tells us of his life as a slave and his escape to freedom. His third autobiography covers much of the subject matter of this first autobiography, plus a story of his life as a leading abolitionist both before and during the Civil War, plus his years as a civil rights activist and leading black leader during the Reconstruction era and the KKK-dominated Jim Crow redemptionist era after the Civil War. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland in the late 1820s. We can only guess exactly how old he is. Like most slaves, he did not know exactly when he was born. Most of the plantations in Maryland grew either cotton or tobacco. The slave masters in the Upper South, including Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, often quickly broke up their slave families, as younger slaves were valuable, and selling slaves to the expanding plantations in Alabama and Mississippi was very profitable. Frederick was both a brilliant and troublesome slave who had many masters before he escaped to freedom in his early 20s. His many masters included some of the worst possible masters and some of the least worst masters. We can't really say there are better masters because that is an oxymoron, and slavery was a morally corrupting institution. For this video, we will not try to track exactly how Frederick came to be with this master or that, since he had so many masters that he was sold to and was leased to. We are mainly interested in what slavery was like and what his life as a slave was like. As Booker T. Washington's slave autobiography also says, Frederick says that slaves are treated like talking livestock on the very first page. And he tells us that most slaves know very little of their ages. Now, the black and white etchings in this video were illustrations in the original printed copy of his third autobiography. Frederick Douglass tells us, "My father was a white man. The opinion was whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother." It is a common custom in Maryland to part children from their mothers at an early age. Often these involuntary orphans would be raised by an old slave woman, too old for field labor. These slave owners would be quick to separate slave children from their parents just about as quickly as people give away puppies from their pet dog's litter. His mother's owner lived about a dozen miles away. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times in his life, and only at night. He says, "My mother died when I was about 7. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or at her funeral. She was long gone before I even knew she had died. Never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death as if she were a stranger." Frederick gives us many instances of the constant and cruel whippings by cruel masters and overseers that were often random and arbitrary. One master, Mr. Plummer, was a cruel man hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He took great pleasure in whipping his slaves. Frederick Douglass remembers, "I had often been awakened at dawn by the most heart-rending shrieks of an aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip her naked back until she was covered with blood. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. Where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped the longest, quitting only when he himself was overcome by fatigue from all the whipping." He tells us of Mr. Hopkins, who liked to whip his slaves in advance of them deserving it. He always managed to have one or two of his slaves to whip every Monday morning. Another overseer, who was called Mr. Severe, and that was his name, he once whipped a woman, causing the blood to run a half an hour at a time, and this too in the midst of her crying children, her children pleading for their mother's release. He seemed to take great pleasure in his fiendish barbarity. Frederick also remembers that slaves were given meager rations of food and clothing. On his first farm, the children were fed mush, which was coarse cornmeal. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were called like so many pigs, and they would come and devour the mush. The child that ate the fastest got the mostest. He that was the strongest got the bestest place. But few children left the trough satisfied. At the farms he worked on when he was young, men and women slaves received as their monthly ration 8 pounds of pork, or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, and like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of winter trousers made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes. The children too young or unable to work had neither shoes, stocking, jacket, nor trousers. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. Now mind you, this is in Maryland. It gets kind of cold in the winter. When these wore out, they went naked until the next allowance day, even if it was winter. Slaves were given no beds. Frederick tells us that at bedtime everyone, old and young, male and female, married and single, dropped down side by side on one common bed, which was often the cold, damp floor, each covering themselves with their miserable blankets. Slaves were occasionally reminded they were considered as mere property, as chattel, such as when Frederick's master died without a will. Frederick was called back to his original master's farm for the dividing of the estate. For many days, these slaves wondered, would some of them be sold at auction? At a slave auction, auctioned off as if they were cattle? They worried, would they be auctioned to many owners, breaking up their slave families into smaller units? Would their new owners be particularly cruel masters? Frederick Douglass remembered the valuation of the estate. Men and women, old and young, married and single, were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. All were physically inspected, slaves and livestock alike, and then the property was divided among the heirs. Our fate for life was now to be decided. We had no more voice in that decision than the animals among whom we were ranked. A single word from the white man was enough, against all our wishes, prayers, and entreaty, to sunder forever from us our dearest friends, kindred, and the strongest ties known to human beings. One slave's fate in this property division was especially cruel, the fate of Frederick's grandmother, who had been the source of the wealth of the deceased master. And Frederick remembered, she had peopled his plantation with slaves. She had rocked the master in his infancy, attended to him in his childhood, and served with him through life. And at his death, wiped from his icy brow the cold death sweat and closed his eyes forever. But the ungrateful heirs, totally ignorant of the services she provided to her now deceased master, they took her to the woods, built her a little hut, put up a little mud chimney, and then made her welcome to the privilege of supporting herself there in perfect loneliness. Thus, they virtually turned her out to die. Frederick reflects on how his slave master father forced himself on to his slave mother. The freedom of the slave master to treat his female slaves as concubines, willing or not, is a feature of nearly all slave societies, from the ancient world to the modern world in the Deep South until the abolition of slavery. Frederick notes that when the master caters to his own lusts, this makes gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning engagement, the slave holder sustains to his slave the double relationship of master and father. These slave concubines were often a constant offense to their mistress. She likes to see them suffer under the lash, and often the mistress sells them off to be rid of them. Although slaves were often mistreated by their masters, rarely were they executed, because slaves were worth as much before the Civil War as economy cars are worth today. They were very valuable property. But, however, slave owners were never brought to justice for killing a slave, and Frederick witnessed 3 occasions when slaves were murdered. One slave, Denby, was shot by an overseer for standing in a creek to avoid a harsh whipping. Another female slave was beat to death for falling asleep when she was tasked with looking after a baby. Yet another was shot for trespassing when hunting for oysters because his master didn't feed him enough. Frederick was delighted to be sent to Baltimore when he was about 8 years old to be the servant of a relative, Mr. and Mrs. Auld, because he was able to clean up and was given a brand new pair of trousers. Frederick liked being a city slave, as he explains. The city slave is almost a free man compared with a slave on a plantation. He is much better fed and clothed and enjoys privileges unknown to the slave on a plantation. There is a vestige of decency, a sense of shame that does much to curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so common on plantations. Few city masters are willing to gain the reputation of being a cruel master. And city masters do not want to be known as a master that did not give their slaves enough to eat. Now, Mrs. Auld of Baltimore had never owned a slave before. As Frederick tells us, prior to her marriage, she had worked for a living and to a good degree was preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. She treated Frederick like he was a fellow human being, and even started teaching him how to read and write until Frederick could spell out words of 3 and 4 letters, until Mr. Auld caught on to what was happening and put a stop to it. Mr. Auld scolded his wife. "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take a yard. A nigger should know nothing but how to obey his master, to do as he is told. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you teach that nigger how to read, there would be no keeping him. He would be forever unfit to be a slave. He would become unmanageable, and he'd be of no value to his master, and would do himself no good neither." After she was scolded for her husband for teaching young Frederick the basics of how to read and write, Mrs. Auld developed a mild, cruel streak, as do all slave owners the longer they own slaves and realize the absolute power they have over their lives. As Frederick learned how to read the newspaper, he read about how the abolitionists were trying to abolish slavery. Like the Liberator, the masthead that we see here, that was the leading abolitionist newspaper of the time. Frederick discovered that his master's fear about his learning how to read had merit. He tells us, "I would at times feel that learning how to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition, without the remedy. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity." Many vivid pictures of slavery were printed in the abolitionist press, so it is little wonder that Southern masters did all they could to keep their slaves from learning how to read, as you can see in this picture, where this poor slave, rather than continuing to be a slave, finally hung himself so he would not fall into the hands of his tormentor. During his teen years, since he was such a troublesome slave, for 6 months Frederick had been handed over to a slave breaker, Master Covey, who had no slaves of his own but broke individual slaves to constant harassment and cruelty. After several months of this mistreatment, Frederick got into a brawl with Master Covey that lasted several hours. If Master Covey had turned him over to the authorities, he would have been executed. But then Mr. Covey would lose his reputation as a slave breaker and could never enjoy the free labor of troublesome slaves. So the two of them established an uneasy truce for the remaining time of his servitude with Mr. Covey, which meant that Frederick Douglass had managed to break the slave breaker. The first time that Frederick and some associates tried to escape slavery in a canoe, they failed and had to spend some time in the slave prison. In Frederick Douglass's second attempt to escape slavery in 1838, he succeeded, fleeing to New York. There, the abolitionists told him he was not safe there, so he was sent to New Bedford, Massachusetts. His observations of a society free of slavery resemble the observations made by Booker T. Washington about the morally debilitating effects of slavery on both master and slave. These are Frederick Douglass's first impressions when he walked the streets of New Bedford, Connecticut. Almost everybody seemed to be at work, but noiselessly so compared to what I had been accustomed to. I saw no whipping of men, but all seemed to go smoothly on. Every man appeared to understand his work and went about it with a sober yet cheerful earnestness. To me this looked exceedingly strange. Frederick continues his observations. Everything in Bedford looked clean, new, and beautiful. I saw few or no dilapidated houses, no half-naked children and barefooted women, such as I had been accustomed to seeing. The people looked more able, stronger, healthier, and happier than those of Maryland. I was, for one, made glad by a view of extreme wealth without being saddened by seeing extreme poverty. But most astonishing was the condition of the colored people. A great many of them were escaped slaves just like me. I found many who had not been 7 years out of their chains, living in finer houses, and evidently enjoying more of the comforts of life than the average slaveholder in Maryland. Now, many years after the end of the Civil War, when they were both old men and when Mr. Auld was suffering from palsy, he heard Frederick was visiting Baltimore, so he sent for Frederick to call on him since he was too infirm to easily leave the house. Frederick asked the ailing and aged Mr. Auld what he thought of his conduct when he ran away to seek his freedom. And Mr. Auld said, "Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave, and if I had been in your place, I would have done as you did." Later in the conversation, he said, "I never liked slavery, and I meant to emancipate all of my slaves when they reached the age of 25. Mr. Auld then told Frederick that his brother-in-law had inherited his grandmother. But when he heard the account in his first autobiography about how she had been exiled to that cabin in the woods, he brought her down to Baltimore and took care of her as long as she lived. When Mr. Auld passed away a short time after their short meeting, the obituary ironically noted that he was a former owner of the famous abolitionist and civil rights leader Frederick Douglass, since he was far more famous and notable than his former master. Frederick Douglass added an appendix when he was challenged for his criticisms of the hypocrisy of many of the white Christian slave masters. And he says in this appendix, "I mean strictly to apply my criticisms to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference for Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." Frederick Douglass continues, "I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show, together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and to show me the path of salvation. This is the man who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution. This is the man who stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. This is the man who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible and denies me the right of learning to read the name of the God who made me. And this is only half of what I quoted in my blog, and my blog even quotes half of what he is saying about this topic. Now, do we detect some bitterness in Frederick Douglass's scathing condemnation? Or is this a rather justifiable anger and frustration at white hypocrisy? Frederick Douglass tells us how one of his masters acted cruelly towards his slaves, starving them, though he had food plenty in his larders, and how he had acted with greater cruelty after his so-called religious conversion. For an example, you can consult my blog where I detail where Frederick Douglass tells us how his so-called Christian master treated his lame slave Henny, abusing her since she could not work, eventually turning her out so she could starve. Frederick Douglass said that some people thought that slaves were happy when they sang while they worked. Frederick Douglass knows that this is not true. Rather, slaves sing most when they are unhappy. The song of the slave represents the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them, but only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. Now we'll discuss the sources in my autobiography. Of course, my main source is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. There are many stories and details in his slave autobiography, the narratives of the life of Frederick Douglass, that we did not cover in this video. Since this is one of the best sellers in the pre-Civil War America, we know it is well written and a joy to read, except that you just want to cringe from the unbelievable cruelties it sometimes describes. In this video, we also had a flashback from his third autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. The particular book on Amazon that we used has slave autobiographies on both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, who belonged to the next generation of black leaders and who had to tolerate the humiliations and brutality of the Jim Crow and KKK dominated Reconstruction and Redemptionist eras in order to fund the black schools needed to help blacks gain a precarious financial foothold in the American economy. And we also have a video on Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery. Please click on the link in the description for our blog on Frederick Douglass's slave autobiography, and please click on the links for other interesting YouTube videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.